Hi, this is Dave. Here's the question. Are there any isms preventing your development? Isms. Let me explain. In an earlier career, I took a position selling surgical staplers to hospitals. Now, it was a leap from the secure job that I had to one that paid straight commission, required me to buy my own samples and literature from the company, and provided only 6 months of draw to begin. But it was not a hasty decision. I looked at the amount of existing business in my new territory, the territory that I was scheduled to get, and I determined that if I could double that, I'd be at a comparable income level to where I started, and then anything above that would be an increase in my income. Yeah, I was young and dumb. So anyway, I left my old job and I arrived in New York City for 6 weeks of intense training on the new one. And during the time that I was there, the district manager who had hired me was replaced. And when I arrived home after the training, my new manager was anxious to meet with me. In our first meeting, before I had a chance to begin working, he informed me that he had revised the sales territories. The territory that I thought I had, the one for which I was hired, was not the one I was going to get. Instead, I was going to receive a territory that had just a fraction of that existing business. And that new territory contained only, honestly, about a third of the existing business of the previous one. And this change meant that my plans for making a living were pretty much shot. It looked to me at this point to be an impossible task. And so, I grew upset and angry. How could they do this to me? I immediately began to look for another job, determined to quickly leave this unethical and uncaring company. But things got worse. As I interviewed several companies, I discovered that they saw me as the problem. Instead of understanding what the company had done to me, they thought I was an opportunist who was looking for an easy way out. It became clear after a few months that no one else was going to hire me. And I grew more and more angry and bitter. In addition, I had little success selling the staplers, and after 6 months, my temporary draw came to an end. I owed the company $10,000, was making almost nothing, and I had no prospects for another job. I felt squeezed between the proverbial rock and hard place. I was the victim of a dirty deal. Then, out of the blue one day, I had an inspiration. Here was the revelation. It was me. The problem was me. That was my revelation. It was me. The problem was me. Okay, the company had treated me poorly. Yes, they'd been unethical and uncaring. Got it. But the product was still exciting and the opportunity still great. The real problem was my attitude. My bitterness and anger were getting in the way of everything. And I was responsible for my own behavior, my own thoughts, and my own attitude. When I had the realization that it was me, I felt like 1,000 pounds had been lifted from my shoulders. If the problem was me, then I could change. If the problem was somebody else, then I was a victim and powerless to do anything about it. That was such a motivational and exhilarating realization. So I began to work on my attitude. I began to take control of my thoughts. And I reasoned that if I was going to get rid of the negative thoughts, I had to put in positive thoughts. So I looked up a bunch of inspiring verses. I got a bunch of them from the Bible. Verses like this, quote, "If God is for you, who can be against you?" End quote. And of course, if you have faith like a mustard seed, etc. So I wrote them down on 3x5 cards. Then, as I drove into my territory every day along I-96 in Detroit, I held them in my hand on the steering wheel and read them over and over to myself. And slowly I began to do away with my bitter attitude and replace it with hope and expectation. And my results began to change. Things began to go better. 6 months later, I had paid off the debt to the company and was making more money than I thought possible. The job had become more fun, more financially rewarding, and more fulfilling than anything I had expected. The turning point for me occurred at the moment I stopped seeing myself as a victim and accepted personal responsibility for my circumstances. It was an important lesson, and I was lucky enough to learn as a relatively young man. Now, however, much of the world today has not learned that lesson. I cringe every time I hear someone claim racism or any of a list of other isms that people blame for their circumstances. As long as they blame someone else for their situation, they will remain victims, prevented from making positive changes in their character, in their attitude, by their adherence to a mindset that puts the responsibility for their situation on someone else. It's not just the charge of racism that has this devastating impact. It's every label we put on people that allows us to claim victimhood and avoid personal responsibility. So, he or she, someone else is a socialist or a conservative or a progressive or a radical, blah, blah, blah. And these labels allow us to blame them and avoid the painful process of self-examination instead. Nor is it just political labels. Labeling someone a feminist or a supremacist or sexist or misogynist are handy ways of putting people into labeled boxes and blaming them for what's wrong in our worlds, and thus abdicating our responsibility to make personal changes. This tendency to claim victimhood and label people is more prevalent today than perhaps at any time in history. However, it's not just a sole 21st century phenomenon. Blaming others for our situation is a dark trait of human character from the beginning. You'll recall that Jesus Christ had some thoughts to share on it. I'm going to quote now Matthew 7, 1-7. He said this, "Why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the wooden beam in your own eye? How could you say to your brother, 'Let me remove that splinter from your eye,' while the wooden beam is in your eye? You hypocrite, remove the wooden beam from your eye first. Then you'll see clearly to remove the splinter from your brother's eye." That's Matthew 7, 1-7. More recently, James Allen said this, quote, "Men are often interested in improving their circumstances, but are unwilling to improve themselves. They therefore remain bound." Isn't it time that we abided by this age-old wisdom and stopped blaming everyone else for our own circumstances? Isn't it time we just accepted personal responsibility and dedicated ourselves to making the changes in our character, in our attitudes, in our thoughts that are called for? Isn't it time? I hope so. That's it. We're done. Bye-bye.